When we're working with identity and access management, we're working with IAM users and groups and roles. First up, the IAM users, they're administrators of the AWS resources that you're working with at AWS. At the very least, they're given access to the management console, but they could also be given access to perform automated tasks, i.e., run scripts. They will have a username and password, and optionally and preferably, multi-factor authentication has been enabled. Any IAM user can be a member of a number of IAM groups, and an IAM user could also be assigned a role, such as accessing another AWS account. The access to the resources will either be using the management console, the command line interface, which you can install for Windows and Linux boxes, or you're a programmer and you're using the APIs using the software development kits. IAM groups contain IAM users, no surprise there, and the permissions assigned with permission policies to a group apply to all of the group members. Now, unlike other networking operating systems, IAM groups can't be nested, and there is no default groups when you start off with AWS. However, IAM users can belong to multiple groups. Even a single-use need should be defined using groups. You'll probably find that single user might have another backup person in your company, and it's much easier to manage assigning permissions by using groups rather than doing it individually per user. However, you may have your reasons why you want to do it per user. An IAM group is a group of IAM users, but the group itself cannot authenticate. And then we have IAM roles. And a role is a listing of permissions, and we define this as a permission policy. An IAM role is kind of interesting because no long-term security credentials are shared, and most of the work is done by AWS. So when I assign a role, say to an end user or to a computer system, they're assuming that role when they make a request to carry out a task based on the permissions defined with that role. Once the role has been approved and assigned, temporary security credentials are provided for access to the resource. So the use of roles could be for an externally authenticated user. That user needs access to something at AWS they've authenticated at work. When they want to access the AWS resources, their credentials that they used at work are verified with a copy of their credentials stored at AWS. Everything checks out. You're assigned a role, which is a set of permissions for temporary access for a period of time. Roles can also be attached to IAM users to allow for cross-account access. This is cross-AWS account access. Let's say Tom, working in development, needed access to production resources in another AWS account. You can define a cross-account access so Tom could access specific AWS services in another account. In this case, you're assigning Tom temporary credentials, and you can define the length of time that he will have access. Whenever you sign up for any AWS service within your AWS account, let's say you sign up for AWS config. Well, there's a role assigned to the AWS config service that defines what that service can do. So whenever config runs in the background to check out your compliance, it's provided with temporary access by AWS, not full-time access, just access when required. Any role that's assigned is authenticated and approved by a service called the Security Token Service. Probably the most popular and useful role to set up is defining a role with an EC2 instance. You have an application running on that instance. It needs access to an AWS service. So rather than using, say, an IAM user and their password for the application to access a resource, let's use a role instead. So we associate an IAM role, which contains the specific policy, the specific requirements for that EC2 instance, such as I need to access an S3 bucket. The credentials, that is the temporary security credentials used for authentication by the application to access the resource, are stored in memory on the EC2 instance. With everything set up, the application can access the service defined by the attached IAM role. Let's say the role only had access for 20 minutes. When it came up to 20 minutes, in the background, the application would have to re-authenticate and reprove themselves to continue accessing the resource. If I want to define cross-account access, this is defining permissions in one particular AWS account using a role. The users in the first AWS account can assume a role to access resources in another linked AWS account. And these resources and the permissions that you add into this role can be anything that's required. We can also define a condition to a role and define that it could only happen on a certain date at a certain time. So for creating an IAM role, we first of all have to define the resource we want to allow access to. Then we define the trust policy. What actions and resources do I want the principal to be able to carry out? Then we define, okay, who can assume this role? Is it a particular user? Is it a particular EC2 instance, for example? Is it somebody that's authenticating from outside of AWS? Is it somebody that's authenticating using Facebook, some external identity provider? Once we decide on all of these conditions, we can associate the permission and policy with the appropriate AWS account or service or identity provider. IAM has a number of different user tools available to manage the users and groups and roles. Of course, we know about the IAM console. We also have AWS CloudTrail, which tracks all of the authentications to your AWS account. We have the credential report, which allows you to download a list of all of the user accounts and the age of their credentials and the age of their access keys. We also have the Access Advisor, which can provide details on what the user account has accessed in the past. We have the notification service, which can be used by CloudTrail to notify you that there's issues. And we have CloudWatch, the monitoring service that can also integrate with CloudTrail and the notification service to alert you if there's issues with authenticating users.